I'm Dr. Henning, and thank you for joining me on this little brief journey to hell. So, John Chrysostom, a 4th century church father, was known for saying, "If only it were possible to preach like this always and continually speak about hell. I know what I say is painful, but I cannot tell you how great a benefit it contains." To us in the contemporary world, that sounds like a really strange thing to say, that you always want to be talking about hell. And so it's important to respect that strangeness and contextualize what Chrysostom says in his 4th century context. When he says he always wants to be talking about hell, he does not live in a world like we do, where today when we think about hell, the first question that might come to our mind is, does hell exist? That is not the first question that would come to the mind of an ancient audience. For an ancient audience, for a person like Chrysostom, the first question that would come to mind when you think about hell is actually, who is there? Because for the ancient person, it is taken for granted that there is this otherworldly space that populates not only Christian tradition, but much earlier than that, other religious traditions and their idea of a lively afterlife. In antiquity before Christianity, Greek and Roman texts that were foundational for education involved tours of hell. And so it was part of the Greek and Roman tradition of education called paideia that you would memorize sections, specifically the sections of the Odyssey and the Aeneid, that involved these dramatic tours to the underworld. Now, of course, they were touring Hades, not Christian hell. But when Chrysostom says in the 4th century that he would always like to be talking about hell, he is actually drawing upon this robust rhetorical tradition and then the years of Christian thinking that developed based upon that rhetorical tradition that follow. So I mentioned that it was a major part of Christian education, or of Greek and Roman education, that you would tour hell. And we know this because the educational texts or educational papyri that are used in the ancient world to write down school exercises have a higher degree of examples of these tours of hell than other parts of the Odyssey, for example. So we know that for an ancient audience, the idea that you would go on a tour of Hades and you would see the surroundings of Hades would be a very common and accepted image, not only to people who were literate, but to other people in the culture who would have heard these stories retold, because they were that familiar. But the other interesting thing about the way that hell works in antiquity is that for Greeks and Romans, they were not just mentioning Hades. And they weren't just taking you on a tour. They were using a very specific rhetorical tool called ekphrasis, which is just a fancy Greek word that describes visual rhetoric that is vivid. One of the main components of ekphrasis, or this vivid visual rhetoric, is that the images have to be believable. They have to make the audience feel like they're really there. So if you're thinking about a tour of hell, you want your audience to feel like they see the sights that Odysseus sees when he's wandering through Hades. When he meets his mother and he weeps, you want them to feel sadness like Odysseus feels. Sometimes Greek and Roman tours would include reward and punishment, and sometimes they wouldn't. One example that includes reward and punishment is in Plutarch's Moralia, in his On the Delays of the Divine Vengeance. Here, a person finds vivid descriptions of 3 specific kinds of punishment, each with its own lesson or moral to be learned. The punishments are described in vivid detail, so using this technique of ekphrasis that I mentioned. It illustrates the colors that are left by the bruises from various vices that Dike, the goddess, attempts to heal through her punishments. It says, "One is drab brown, the stain that comes of meanness and greed. Another, fiery blood red, which comes of cruelty and savagery. Where you see the blue-gray, some form of incontinence in pleasure has barely been rubbed out. while if spite and envy are present, they give out this livid green, as if ink is ejected by the squid. So in Plutarch's vision of hell, the bruises that are left by decay's punishments have this vivid color to them. So much so that the souls who had displayed envy in life are literally green with envy. So there would be this memory attached to the vivid language that makes the audience member feel as though the things that they're seeing have some kind of verisimilitude or truth to them. Now, even though some of the texts involve punishments and others do not, one thing that is common between the Greek and Roman depictions of Hades and Christian depictions of hell is that they always contain some larger lesson that the reader was supposed to learn. So in Lucian's Menippus, for example, we find a cutting critique of the wealthy, in which in Hades, the rich are turned into donkeys, and they are made to bear the burdens of the poor for 250 years. It's an image that is not only hard to forget, it is also, Lucian's a comedian, it's meant to be funny, and by making the audience laugh at this ridiculous image of the rich bearing the poor on their backs for 250 years, the audience is also able to call up all kinds of emotions that are associated with that joke. And it is a way of persuading them to think about something that they might not be very willing to think about otherwise. And then finally, before we get to Christian depictions of hell, we also have otherworldly spaces of the Jewish apocalypses. So in ancient Judaism, we have this whole tradition of apocalyptic texts. And in texts like 1 Enoch 22, the righteous and the wicked are separated. They are in waiting in little caves to receive rewards and punishments when the day of judgment comes. So we don't have a robust depiction of hell yet in these texts, but in Jewish apocalypticism, there's definitely this idea that the righteous and the wicked are separated and that there is going to be some kind of future judgment in which they will meet a different end. And then there's also in 1 Enoch a depiction of Gehenna as a place of fire for the wicked, which becomes very important for one of the first Christian authors that we're going to talk about, for Matthew. So when we come to Christianity, Christians make this rhetoric, this visual rhetoric, even more intense. They take the Jewish apocalyptic tradition and the tradition of the two ways that we find in the Hebrew Bible of this idea of there being separate spaces for the wicked and the righteous, and then they take the rhetorical force of this vivid visual rhetoric, this ekphrasis, and they combine it together so that they have depictions of hell that are very persuasive for early Christian readers. So Matthew, for example, when he depicts Jesus talking about otherworldly spaces in which there will be torment for some and rewards for others, he is hoping to evoke emotion in his audience, but not for just any end. He wants to evoke emotion in his audience to get them to live out the values of the Sermon on the Mount. So for Matthew, like the Greco-Roman authors, the goal is education, but the ethical content of that education is very specific. He describes spaces of eschatological judgment and eternal punishment in each of the major teaching sections of this gospel, and he connects these depictions with the idea of weeping and gnashing of teeth, the furnace of fire, and outer darkness. These images are meant to call up emotions, just like the ekphrasis of the Greek and Roman tradition. So the image of the weeping and gnashing of teeth is only mentioned once in the Gospel of Luke, and it is mentioned almost like a refrain in Matthew. And he wants his audience, through this weeping and gnashing of teeth image, to imagine the sadness and the intense separation that occurs between the wicked and the righteous if the ethical message of the Sermon on the Mount is not heeded. So prior to their use in Matthew, these phrases, weeping and gnashing of teeth, furnace of fire, outer darkness, are not references to eternal punishment or hell. It's only in the Gospel of Matthew that then we find these phrases describing a place of judgment and punishment that is contrasted throughout the Gospel with the kingdom of heaven. So for many readers, this would probably call to mind the otherworldly spaces of judgment of the Jewish apocalypses, but it also intensifies that idea, using these visual rhetoric cues and notions of punishment from the Greco-Roman world that many members of Matthew's audience, and Matthew, who is a Greek reader and speaker himself, would probably be familiar with. But this really comes to culmination in Matthew 25, where we see a day of judgment in which goats are sent into eternal fire that is prepared by the devil and his angels, and we see sheep who are about to receive eternal reward. The separation of the sheep and the goats is an image that specifically calls out the ethical teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. So the people who inherit eternal reward are the people who meet the physical needs of the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned. And the people who are sent into eternal punishment are the people who do not meet the needs of the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned. Matthew combines the familiar images, the agricultural image of separating sheep and goats, the image of all of these persons who would be readily recognizable to early Christians because of their special obligation to these groups. Lucian has a joke, for example, about how a Christian in prison is actually exhausted because of all the guests that he has to entertain, because people are visiting him so frequently that it's actually irritating and he can't get any rest. And this is important in the context of the ancient prison, of course, because while prisons today involve food and shelter and many of your basic needs being met, in the ancient world that's not the case. So a Christian who was in prison actually relied upon people to bring them food, for example, for their daily sustenance. So then Lucian has this joke that tells us that Christians in the first century, when Matthew's writing his gospel, would have been familiar with the idea that caring for the prisoner among them was not only a good thing, but their ethical responsibility for that person's livelihood and existence. So he combines these familiar images in order to persuade the audience to behave in specific ethical ways. And when he does this, it is a tradition that gets inherited by future people in early Christianity who are writing about hell. One of the things that was startling to me when I first started doing this research is that the people who are writing about hell in the 1st and 2nd centuries and beyond are frequently citing Matthew. And the people who are punished in these depictions are, like Matthew, similarly the people who do not care for the other. So we think about hell in the contemporary world as something about individualism and punishing specific individual sins, but it's very clear that for early Christians, this was a way of imagining the radical need to care for the other, using contemporary rhetorical tools. So for example, in the Apocalypse of Paul 40, the people who wore holy garments in life, but who do not have compassion on widows, orphans, take in the stranger and the pilgrim, arrange meals for the hungry, or show mercy to the neighbor, are described as being in rags of tar and sulfur with dragons around their necks, while angels with fiery horns beat them and close their nostrils. Like Matthew, there's a heavy emphasis here on care for the other, and the visual images describe vivid scenes of torture to get early Christians to behave ethically. Although we see here that there's definitely a ramping up of the imagery, right? What the Apocalypse of Paul describes is a lot scarier than what we saw described in Matthew with the weeping and gnashing of teeth. As we move to the contemporary world, in the United States we see a kind of a mismatch between these ancient texts that I've just described for you that are focused on ethical behavior and care for the other, and rhetoric of hell in our contemporary culture that is frequently focused on conversion, which is not the focus of the early Christian depictions of hell, but a function of 18th and 19th century American culture. And what is more, in the contemporary world, when we think about hell, we're frequently thinking about a place that actually exists and not necessarily rhetoric. So then the question is, what do we do with the fact that the ethical emphasis that caring for the other is of ultimate importance is now lost amidst American individualism and our fascination with ancient rhetorical tactics of emotional persuasion rather than the ethical content that was conveyed by those tactics? When it comes to thinking about Jesus' teachings about hell, I think we would do well to think more about what he was asking of people than about how he framed those questions. So in one sense, I agree with Chrysostom's sentiment that it is useful to talk about hell. It is useful to talk about hell in order to think seriously about the rhetoric of fear and the impact that it has had on the Christian tradition. But in another sense, I think that rather than preaching about hell, we should think seriously about the ethical message of radical love and care for the other that is at the core of these early Christian teachings about hell. The most pressing question then to ask ourselves, as Matthew and Chrysostom did, is what are the best rhetorical tools of our day at our disposal to communicate that message of love?